Hey Chris, welcome to the stream. It's funny because my name isn't Mark. The gospel messed me up. Uh, it's fine. Just starting a little bit late because I had to do something just before starting stream, so not like it's a big deal. I'm gonna end up padding this with like other stuff because the stream probably won't be that long. Like I'm just gonna do the one chapter, right? So it's that is okay. Funny story about that though. Originally my mom wanted to name me Mark, but what my mom, I guess, was kind of didn't quite catch right away is that it's just a standard rule of thumb for like Asian families. You try to avoid naming your kids names that have like strong R sounds because, for instance, like my grandparents wouldn't be able to pronounce that, so uh, it was changed to Michael. I was essentially named by my grandmother. Okay, why? Okay, so Chris asked, why is Jesus' divinity less articulate in the Gospel of Mark than the Gospel of John? You think it was a evolvement or something else? Okay, so I mentioned this before. I talk a lot more about this in my Luke reading, so you probably have to go back to those videos. There's a playlist on the channel. So one of the issues, it's not, oh, I shouldn't call it an issue, but one of the issues of reading the book of Mark, especially as like us in the 21st century. This is something that just like many when you hear Christians talk about this, they tend to like gloss over this, and I feel like when Christians do this, it's a massive disservice, especially when you're trying to talk to people who are not as familiar with the Bible about it. But uh, let me just finish this before I lose my train of thought. Okay, so one of the things about the book of Mark that isn't true in the book of John is that, see, the book of Mark is compiled of a bunch of like, basically think of it like this. So during the book of Acts period, so this is like, let's say 35 AD till, let's say, roughly 65 AD. So basically what church consisted of was basically like the Christians meeting at each other's houses and just talking about how cool Jesus was. That was basically church. And so over time though, as they got tons of new converts, the movement of Christianity, what would later become Christianity, it became massive. And so the church the early church leaders were just like, well, crap, we better actually write this stuff down, because some of us have been killed off at this point. Uh, and of course, there's the whole we're getting old thing. So they're like, all right, so that means we're gonna have to start writing this stuff down. And so the book of Mark. Okay, so before I get to the book of Mark, there's in Bible scholarship there's something referred to as the Q source. The Q source is said to be like the earliest writings of Christian documents, and then those were kind of collected together, and there were like tens of thousands of these, which is many Christians argue for like the legitimacy of the Gospels, because why if the whole life of Jesus thing wasn't true, why would people bother writing so much about it if it wasn't true? That's basically the what's the actual name for the argument? It's the bibliographic argument, I think is what it's called. I don't often use the bibliograph. Well, actually, I have used the bibliographic argument because you kind of have to when you're talking about like the Book of Luke for sure. But anyway, so the bibliographic argument for Christianity is the idea that because so many people wrote about it, if they wouldn't have, the Christians wouldn't have bothered writing about it if it wasn't true. That's the TLDR of that argument. So there are a bunch of these documents, and then they were brought together. And this is where in Catholic tradition, it was believed that Peter's secretary, a guy by the name of John Mark, was the guy who took those compilements and then turned it into the Gospel of Mark. And so, with that being the case, the Gospel of Mark is essentially just this is the life of Jesus, this and that happened. That's basically the gist of the book of Mark. That's why the book of Mark is so light compared to the other Gospels, and why when you look at Matthew and Luke, and I explain this a lot more in the book of Luke readings, they expounded on particular themes based on the life of Jesus. So in the book of Matthew, Matthew heavily correlates Jesus with the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch. So that's why you see a lot of parallels between Moses and Jesus. If you want a fun modern day version of this understanding of like the Gospels, that's the way how in traditional comic books, when Joel Shuster wrote the character of Superman, Superman was actually a clear analog to the character of Moses. But in later times in comic books and making Jesus far more how do I put it, uh, more paragon morality, then that's where the whole like Superman as a Christ figure kind of emerges. So in the same way, the book of Mark is kind of written in that way. So Jesus has very close parallels with Moses. The book of Luke is interested in how Jesus breaks down cultural barriers so that the movement of Christianity is a multi-ethnic one. Because if you compare it with the book of Matthew, and even in the book of John, it's very Jewish in its thinking, whereas the book of Luke and by extension the book of Acts is very non-Jewish. And so, to answer your question, because the book of Mark simply is the earliest writings and they were not concerned with particular themes. When you get to the book of John, which is believed to be written at earliest 75 AD, probably closer to like 85 to 90 AD, people believe that at that point in Christian history, so Christianity had been around for like half a century at this point, that's where you start getting like other ideas and philosophies kind of creeping into the Christian world, and this is where like the heresies discourse starts, and so like Gnosticism being a big one, and so there was things like Arianism is a well-known heresy as well. So you have to be familiar with Arianism and Gnosticism. So the TLDRs of Arianism is the idea of the spiritual world being overly carnal. And a best way of explaining this is like basically, I mean, we kind of we modern like you probably hear a lot of people talk about like how you can explain every miracle in the Bible through science. That's kind of a form of Arianism, where basically nothing in the Gospels is really supernatural. It was just like just fancy ways of explaining weird phenomena in the natural world. Because Arianism fundamentally believes that all things that we consider spiritual are actually just other extensions of the material. And so when it comes to the person of Jesus, Arianism focuses on like just the humanity of Jesus. Whether he's divine or not is not relevant. And this is where you get the whole like in modern thinking, you get the whole like, well, isn't it good enough just to be a good person when it comes to morality and how to be in the good standings with God, if you will. Just be a good enough person. Because at the end of the day, it's all about how people live. So that's Arianism in a nutshell. I totally like once again, this is me like trying to break down Arianism into like less than 5 minutes. Remember, this has been a philosophy that's been battled for over 2 millennia. So, and same with Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the opposite belief that physical bad, spiritual good. And so, this is where you get a lot of the whole like Zen Buddhism is basically the Buddhist equivalent of Gnosticism, where you break down the physical aspects of like Buddhist teaching and then you turn it solely to spiritual. In the same way, Christianity ran into this problem when Gnostic thought was incorporated into Christian circles. And so people stopped caring as much about things like the resurrection of Jesus. It was a spiritual manifestation of God, not like a bodily resurrection. And so the book of John, probably like the whole like driving sorry, I took a see, this is why like when I had to explain two things that had like 2 millennia of context that were problems in the early church. Like there's a long prelude before we actually start the Bible reading. But to finally answer your question proper, Jesus's divinity is more articulate in the book of John because those things were probably becoming a thing in the Christian world, which is where that's why more people adopt a later date for the Gospel of John being written, because those things are being addressed. Whereas the book of Mark, this is not the case. It's simply not the case. Because either one, if those things were around, it might have been too early in its Christian heresy phase for it to matter, or simply that Mark just didn't care. So that's the best answer I can give to why the book of Mark doesn't really articulate Jesus' divinity. The other thing that is kind of just a thing with like, you've probably heard me use this term on this channel a number of times, but like speaking Christianese. So the book of Mark has some of that. It has that speaking Christianese aspect to it. Whereas like you take the book of Luke, and the book of Luke tries to avoid that as much as possible, because the book of Luke is trying to appeal to a wider audience. But the book of Mark has a lot of Christianese, and the reason for that is because the context would be that it's assumed that with the whole earlier writing thing, it's assumed that everyone that would be listening to like a church sermon would already know who Jesus was, would have already known all the stuff that had been happening. All the stuff in the book of Acts, some of it would even be like happening live kind of thing. Like these things were happening. We're not talking about a period that like the older generation looked fondly back on. We're not talking about that. We're talking about stuff that's still going on. And so with that being said, the book of Mark, people just assume this, and it's pretty likely that the original audience of the book of Mark, they would have just assumed certain things. That's where I had the whole meme of, 5 times already, as we've read through 5 chapters, 5 times Jesus has basically said he's God without saying he's God. Because the audience would have already had all the context and clues. They would have already known. The resurrection would have been still fresh in some people's memories. So all that stuff is just assumed in the book of Mark. Whereas when I was doing the book of Luke reading, I had to explain that because that wasn't as obvious in the book of Luke. People didn't just assume that. Because why would they? Especially a bunch of Greeks from like a place like Antioch. Why would they ever assume that? Whereas in the book of Mark, a lot of those things, and that's one of the things, like the reason why chapter 5 took so long last week was because I had to explain a bunch of things that was assumed to the Christian audience of Mark's time. Anyway, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson reads the Gospel of Mark. And today we are gonna have a shorter stream today. We're just gonna read through one chapter, but it's a pretty hefty chapter, so I think we'll still spend a good like hour and 20 minutes on it. And that is reading Mark chapter 6. So I encourage you guys to read along with me. I'll be using the New International Version with the Streaming Parson abridged notes added, just so as we move through the text faster, basically. I encourage you guys to read along.